York, this is Democracy Now!
The situation that we're talking about is the lack of compassion for those elders, not just Native elders, but all elders, all people with underlying health conditions like cancer. It is an absolute choice, a clear choice to choose profit over people. So the governor isn't putting people first, he's putting profit first.
In this holiday special, we look at how COVID-19 is devastating Native communities across the United States. We'll speak to members of the Standing Rock Sioux and Navajo Nation and go to North Dakota, which has the highest COVID-19 death rate of any state or country in the world. Then Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez looks at how the corporate media missed the real story about Latinx voter turnout in the 2020 election.
The main story is that in an election which saw historic turnout, people of color, and especially Latinos, had an unprecedented increase in voting. And they, not white voters, represented the bulk of that increase.
Plus, we speak to anti-racist activist Bree Newsom-Bass and Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude about the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
We have to get about the work of responding to the problems we face as a nation at scale and not returning back to some sense of normalcy, which in some ways laid the foundation for the disaster that was and is Trumpism.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, in this special broadcast, we look at this year's historic election and the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. We begin in North Dakota, which has the highest COVID-19 death rate of any state or country in the world, with 1 in every 1,000 residents dead from the virus. South Dakota's death rate is nearly as bad after both Republican governors spent months downplaying the crisis. As COVID-19 ravages the Dakotas, we turn to look at how the rapid spread of COVID-19 is affecting Native American communities. We begin with 2 guests. Jody Archambault is a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the former special assistant to President Obama for Native American Affairs for the White House Domestic Policy Council. She's in Bismarck, the capital of North Dakota. And in Farmington, New Mexico, we're joined by Ali Young, a citizen of Navajo Nation, founder of Protect the Sacred. She lives in Arizona. I began by asking Jody Archambault to talk about the pandemic's devastating effect on Native Americans.
This has been a tough several months, just hoping that the government takes action. The state government, the way that they behave and the way that they react affects our people directly, mostly because we have some of the highest rates of the underlying conditions that make COVID-19 a deadly disease. And so we're having a lot of people perish. We're having a lot of death, a lot of hospitalizations, and it's affecting us in ways that is not widely known by the rest of America. We have very few years. We have about maybe a decade, maybe 15 years where we have to save our language, our Lakota language, our Dakota language. We also have other tribes in North Dakota who, like the Arikara, the Mandan, and the Hidatsa, most of the speakers of our languages are over the age of 70. And we don't have very much time to spend with them and learn and protect and revitalize our languages. And COVID-19 has put on an additional layer of risk that is just putting us into a very difficult time.
And Jody Archambault, how did it get to this stage, especially in the Native communities of the state? How did the pandemic spread so rapidly in your community?
It didn't spread very rapidly at first. As you know, the COVID-19 hit the cities first and hit Seattle and New York City. In North Dakota and South Dakota, we shut down the businesses and took a lot of precautions early on. until about May. And North and South Dakota were the first states to open their doors to business as usual. Restaurants, people were shy at first, but at this point, there's a lot of people who have followed the line of thinking that COVID-19 is a hoax or it's some kind of Democrat conspiracy. And a lot of people refuse to wear masks, even with the mask mandate. This has all accelerated on the reservations. Reservations or tribal nations such as Eagle Butte, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and the Ogallala Sioux Tribe, the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Rosebud. They've all installed roadblocks. They've all implemented roadblocks to stop traffic and outsiders from coming on the reservation. And the response to their action to protect tribal members, elders, and the like was for the Governor Noem to torture them and hold them hostage with funding. She's coordinated with the Trump administration to make it difficult to receive the federal resources that are allocated to the tribal governments, and have used that as a stick for them to try to force them to take the roadblocks down. And rather than supporting them and thanking them for trying to address the lack of health services available on the reservation, she's made it more and more difficult for our tribes to protect ourselves.
Dakota governor, can you talk about his originally saying that people who are healthcare workers who test positive for COVID should remain working if they are asymptomatic and treat COVID-19 patients, and Governor Burgum then being forced to back down after the outcry, saying no to a mask mandate, then saying yes?
I'll just tell you that it's really hard to speak up in North Dakota. The news sources out here don't cover an alternate perspective. But I will say that the Nurses Association and advocacy group did issue a press release after Governor Burgum said that they could go back to work while they were testing COVID positive. That was last week on Wednesday, and within hours there was a pushback from the Nurses Association. None of the hospitals have taken him up on the offer, and it's ridiculous that the leadership's response to being the worst COVID rates in the world would be to allow nurses to infect other nurses, other doctors, and other patients by coming to work with COVID. It's the most preposterous type of government action that I've ever heard of. So the business of the hospital is asking for this kind of, I guess, allowance to allow sick people without symptoms to come and spread. But actually, the situation that we're talking about is the lack of compassion for those elders, not just Native elders, but all elders, all people with underlying health conditions like cancer. It is an absolute choice, a clear choice to choose profit over people. So the governor isn't putting people first, he's putting profit first. And the same with Governor Noem down in South Dakota. She has been actively asking people to come to South Dakota, come to the second hottest spot in the world, and have your vacation, because we don't care if you wear a mask or not. That's what her response is. And to increase the risk that tribal governments, by forcing them to take down their barriers or trying to force them down, they haven't taken them down. It's remarkable that they're able to stick to that governance decision that is saving lives on the reservations. It's still spreading. It's still spreading on the reservations because there is active commerce between reservations and cities, and so it's getting in.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in Ali Young to the conversation, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and founder of Protect the Sacred. Ali, welcome to Democracy Now! Could you talk about the situation in Navajo Nation in terms of COVID And also maybe comment on the fact that not all native areas have gaming, but quite a significant percentage do. And often it's the gaming revenues that help provide health services or social services. Could you talk about the impact of the shutdowns on the ability of the native peoples to provide health services as well?
Yeah. Yata, hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Right now we are seeing another surge in Navajo Nation, as we expected. We, as you all know, we're the #1 hotspot in the country per capita in the spring. And we worked hard to flatten the curve, and we were able to. There was a day where we had 0 reported cases. But recently, because of the spikes across the country, what we've been seeing throughout the nation with some of the rallies, I mean, some of our border towns around here are Trump territory. And so there were rallies that I witnessed. And a lot of our people come into these border towns to do their shopping because on Navajo Nation, we have like 13 grocery stores. So we have to travel to these territories where they're not thinking about, they're not wearing masks, and they're not thinking about their neighbors who've been impacted. And then to your point about the gaming industry and in Native communities, at Navajo Nation, we have some casinos and hotels as well, and they've all been shut down, and it has impacted us economically and financially. And as far as healthcare, we've had to, I worked on a PSA through Protect the Sacred that called out for medical volunteers. And that's the state that we were in, that we had to make that call out for PPE supplies, medical volunteers, because we just lack all of those resources and funding in our tribal communities when, we're supposed to be guaranteed quality healthcare through our treaties with the federal government.
And Ali Young, you've talked about feeling that so many Native elders are suffering as a result of the decades of uranium mining, particularly of pulmonary and respiratory diseases, making them even more vulnerable. We're talking something like over 600 people just on the Navajo reservation have died as of this weekend of COVID.
Yes, that is something that I am trying to connect the dots to anyone I speak to, is let's not forget about how the federal government greenlit these companies coming in to extract our minerals and tribal reservations. In Navajo Nation for 30 plus years, we had Peabody up in the northwestern region of Navajo Nation, which was our hotspot within the nation. And a lot of our people up there, the waters and our lands are contaminated by uranium. And our elders had to work through, and even my own uncles, they just shut down last year in 2019. So a lot of our people have worked through those unsafe environments and certainly have those pre-existing and underlying conditions that we need to consider and why we're so vulnerable to this virus.
Jody Archambault, can you overall talk about the massive voter turnout, at least increase in Native American turnout, not noted in the mainstream media?
Sure. I just want to say that despite the risk of being exposed to COVID, the numbers were incredible. And I think that this is something that is often overlooked by mainstream media, only because mainstream media has a tendency to leave out the full picture when it comes to Native Americans. In fact, CNN did an infographic, and they did a breakdown of all the different people who voted in the election, and for Native Americans, they didn't have us labeled as Native Americans. They called us something else.
We have that actual graphic right here. It says white, it says Latino, it says black, and then something else, and then Asian.
Yep. Yeah. And social media, we are very much, our resiliency is through our humor. And so it just took off. Everybody kept saying, like, Custer said, yeah, they sure are something else, Custer from the last couple of centuries ago. And a lot of people have just taken it as a call to try to bring attention to the people at CNN, to the people at the mainstream who just continuously don't see us. They don't see us, and it's intentional because we are a reminder of the bloodshed that it took to make this country. We're not congruent with the American dream, and we're still here. We're actually leading the way on how to handle pandemics because we've been through so many of them, and it's so much ingrained in our communities that we're not seeing this as we're not victims in this. We're actually ready to fight. We're ready to push back and do what we can to protect ourselves because it's the only way we've made it this far. And we know that people in America don't see us, so we have to do it for ourselves.
Still with us in Arizona is Ali Young, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and founder of Protect the Sacred. Ali, if you could start off by talking about what you did in Arizona. Talk about the horseback ride that you took.
I worked with my father, who lives in Rough Rock, Arizona. Sorry, and we worked together. And I've always voted in Arizona, sided with my father, and we've always done trail rides. That's our bonding thing, and we've done them throughout Navajo Nation. And this year, when we were thinking about the election, he wanted to do a Biden-Harris trail ride. And when I called him back and thought about the significance of a trail ride and the respect that our people have for the horses, and as we call it, horse medicine. And horse medicine is when you are in rhythm with the horse and almost in sync, and you're reconnected and refocused as you ride in our own homelands and are reminded of exactly what our ancestors have fought for, our lands to still be in our own homelands and our cultures and also our right to vote. So I went back to my father and I said, so what's happening with the trail ride? And he said, yeah, I don't know. I don't think we're going to do it. And I said, I think we should do it. But with Protect the Sacred, I have to be nonpartisan. So if it's more of a getting folks out to the polls so that they can cast their ballots, I think we should do that because at the same time, I think that our Native American youth, I was hearing on the ground that they weren't feeling very motivated to participate in this election as a lot of other communities of color because, why continue participating in a system that has never worked for us? It is not working for us. I often find that our Native youth are, we are more educated than ever. That's why there's this resistance because, we know our history and what has happened to us historically. And also we're more connected to technology and information than ever. And we're more eager to reconnect to our cultures and that respect for our ancestors and our elders are still there. And so I wanted to strategize and use that and say, okay, let's find something that will excite our Native youth that's rooted in our culture that will also help us reclaim Arizona because, I keep saying that Arizona is indigenous DNA. It is not Republican DNA, as I heard on the news when I was watching about a month before we decided to do trail ride to the polls. And that's what really motivated me is because Arizona has this deep history of many tribal communities, and it is not just a place where white conservatives go to retire. And this is our homelands, and I called on my people, let's show up, let's show them that we're still here, let's be represented, let's make sure that we have a seat at the table and that our voices are heard. And so that's why it was so important, and I'm so happy that a lot of young people did come out. It did excite them. I got so many positive messages from our efforts, and I think it was a positive turnout.
And Ali, I wanted to ask you about that. What were the results? What you've been able to tell? Not so much, obviously, because the exit polls didn't factor in or count Native American votes. But what's been the results and the actual vote totals that you've been able to see so far?
Yeah, well, I believe around 60-something thousand Navajos in Navajo Nation. So we, Coconino County, Navajo County, which is where I did all of my work and I vote in Navajo County, and Apache County, they all overlap the Navajo Nation. And in those areas, Navajo people turned out to vote. I think 84% of those who had registered turned out to vote, and 97% of those who cast their ballot voted for Joe Biden. And that's just incredible. That just shows the contribution of the Native vote in key swing states, in not only the Navajo Nation, but there is a map that compares tribal communities, and all of those tribal communities voted blue. And so we came out strong. I think we did do a great job in reclaiming Arizona, saying that we're still here, that we've always been here, and that now, we're going to keep working to hold this new administration accountable as well.
What kind of message do you have for what is the most effective way to get first-time voters involved, to make them feel like they really are making a difference when it's, they haven't done this before?
My strategy was all around, you got to think about what we're working with. And with young people, we are very tuned in to social media. So definitely it is a powerful tool. So connecting with them that way, we had a huge social media strategy, and also layering in the cultural revitalization, and is particularly with Native youth, and but also I think with a lot of other youth across other communities of color, because I think we're in this amazing moment where all of our communities of color are reconnecting to our cultures and really proud of who we are and where we come from. So using that and saying, let's show up in that way. Let's show through social media, fighting for our representation, that takes work. And we have to, we're not just going to automatically, be talked about in the media. We have to show up.
And Ali, I'm wondering just if you could quickly say what your main expectations are of the new Biden administration's policy toward Native American people.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to be making sure that we're represented, especially when it comes to climate change. We do want a seat at the table. We want to be in that conversation because we have just incredible knowledge about how the ways that we respect Mother Earth, that we honor Mother Earth, and those are things that will end up saving Mother Earth. And so learning from us and collaborating with us, and also on issues of, we're still in COVID-19 and it's still severely impacting our tribal communities. So we're expecting them to work with us and helping us to bring the funding and the aid that we need, because $8 billion was not enough in the initial stimulus package.
Navajo activist Ali Young, the founder of Protect the Sacred, and Jody Archambault, a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. She served as the former special assistant to President Obama for Native American Affairs for the White House Domestic Policy Council. Coming up, Juan Gonzalez and how the corporate media got it wrong, missed the real story about Latinx voter turnout in the 2020 election.
Shine your light, we are equal. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. Get ready for the glorious comeback of our people. Oh, yeah. Rise up, All you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We continue to look at this year's historic election. We turn now to Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez, professor at Rutgers University. He looks at how the corporate media missed the real story about Latinx voter turnout in the 2020 election and how Latino and Latina voters helped Joe Biden win the presidency.
Well, Amy, the cascade of stories continues, claiming a surprising turn by Latino voters toward Donald Trump. The New York Times this week, front page, quote, how Democrats missed Trump's appeal to Latino voters. The LA Times, Latino voters tired of being taken for granted by baffled Democrats. CNN and others claiming there's no such thing as a Latino bloc. And even The Intercept saying in one of their stories that non-white voters are not immune to right-wing populism. Well, I said last week, and I will repeat it again, the key narrative of this election is not whether there was a small shift in the percentage of Latinx voters in some areas of the country turning toward Trump. The main story is that in an election which saw historic turnout, people of color, and especially Latinos, had an unprecedented increase in voting. And they, not white voters, represented the bulk of that increase. Virtually none of the reports have mentioned this, that for the first time in U.S. history, Latinos turnout appears to have reached comparable levels to the rates for white and black Americans. 20.6 million Latinos went to the polls in this election. That's 64% of the 32 million eligible Latinx voters, while in previous election cycles, the turnout had been routinely below 50%. In raw numbers, 8 million more Latinos voted this year than in 2016. That's a 63% increase over the last presidential elections. Now, I've updated and tweaked the chart from last week, and it shows that the biggest increase in both percentages and actual votes from 4 years ago came from Latino voters. Their jump in number of ballots cast nearly equaled that the increase among white and black voters combined. The next biggest jump in percentage term came among African-American voters, who increased by 20%, Asian Americans by 16%, while white voters increased by just under 6%. Now, some of these numbers, I should note, are different from what I displayed last week, in part because there's been some little noticed changes to the Edison National Exit Poll in the past few days compared to what was released on Election Day by all the networks. For instance, the original version estimated that whites were 65% of the electorate, while the latest figures say that they were 67%. And the poll also increases turnout for African Americans and Asians. Well, the Edison poll has always been flawed, and numerous analyses have shown its past samples were skewed to oversampling Cuban Americans, undersampling both black and Latino inner city polling sites, and also undersampling voters whose primary language is not English, all of which means it tends to undercount Latino voters for Democrats. But the basic contours of the sampling remains the same, and it's inescapable. After decades of political experts talking about the growing Latino vote, this year it actually happened. Hispanic voters felt compelled like never before to go to the polls because COVID-19 felled them more than other groups, because of the constant demonization of Latinos by the president, because of the barbaric family separation policies, or because of the threats to health care, even for some conservative Latinos, because of their hopes of finally turning back Roe v. Wade. One thing is sure. Neither the Democratic nor Republican parties will underestimate or ignore Latino voters from now on. This should be cause for widespread celebration as a long-awaited democratization of the vote. But what about those who claim that Trump made major unexpected inroads among Latino voters nationwide, as reflected by the 66 to 32% split of the Latino vote between Biden and Trump? Some say that Latinos could be deserting the Democratic Party. Those of us who've been around the block a few times have heard this narrative before. In reality, these results are in the general ballpark of previous presidential campaigns. I want to put up, hopefully, a chart here of how Latinos split their vote over the last 30 years in presidential elections. The Republican share of voters has varied from a low of 27% when Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama in 2012 to a high of 44% that George Bush got in his second presidential run in 2004. Even John McCain, when he ran against Obama in 2008, got a similar percentage of the Latino vote as Trump did this year. And the high point, the Bush victory in 2004, we should note, is the last time a Republican candidate got a majority of the popular vote. But the big difference now is that the Latinx vote is so much larger. When you get 2/3 of a vote that has tripled in size in just a few years, you begin to achieve critical mass. No wonder Lindsey Graham is warning that if these elections aren't changed somehow, Republicans will never win the White House again. What about those places like the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and South Florida, where Trump made real inroads in largely Latino districts in the actual vote? Or what about those pundits who claim Latinos are so diverse and diffuse as a population that it is erroneous to consider them a single community? First, on South Africa and the Rio Grande Valley, yes, actual vote results show that Trump had significant increases in his support there. Florida is not surprising, given the influx of conservative refugees from Nicaragua and Venezuela in recent years, but the Rio Grande Valley is. In Hidalgo County, along the border, which is 90% Latino, Trump went from 27% against Hillary Clinton to 40% against Joe Biden. In Maverick County, which is 95% Latino, he went from 20% against Clinton to 45% against Biden. Those are significant numbers. The Valley, however, has changed rapidly during the Trump era. Always a socially conservative rural area, it has seen enormous job growth in recent years as a result of the militarization of the border, which brought thousands of new jobs to the area for Border Patrol officers, for workers on private construction of the wall with Mexico, for immigration detention centers. In addition, the Valley has replaced the San Diego sector as the epicenter of undocumented migrant crossings and the failed immigration system of the United States. All of that, no doubt, helped turn its residents for Trump. But in the big cities of Texas, where most Latinos live, there's another story. San Antonio's Bexar County, for example, 60% Latino, saw Biden's margin of votes climb from 54 to 58%, though we'll need better figures on how much of that was in the Latino community. It seems clear, however, that Latino turnout in states like Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania helped Biden win those key battleground states. And then there's California and New York. The Latino share of the vote that went to Biden appears to be breathtaking in those states. 77% in California, 72% in New York. Now, some argue that those are reliable blue states anyway, so those Hispanic voters are not really critical. Really? Aren't those enormous Latino margins year after year what has made those states reliably blue? And the same for New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and lately Colorado. Then there are these nonsensical questions as to whether a Latino community actually exists. Let's be clear. Latinx identity in the United States is a social construct created both by the dominant society that needed to define and categorize an other, and by the marginalized group itself organically from the ground, by disparate Latin American migrant groups who were forced to unite in order to survive in a hostile society and whose children gradually intermarried to create a new social construct, the Latino in America. More than 20 years ago, I said in my book, Harvest of Empire, that Latinos had were becoming a new third force in American politics. They largely vote Democratic, but a significant portion is susceptible to Republican candidates if those political leaders address even a few of their concerns. Since then, Latin Americans from educated and middle-class backgrounds have migrated to this country in growing numbers, and a good portion have adopted typical American conservative views. Some of that community, though still a minority, have been drawn to right-wing populism, to national chauvinism, and even to racist views. All of this fixation on Latinos, however, ignores the fundamental question of this election, which very few political observers I've seen have dared to tackle. Why the heck did 58% of white Americans vote for Donald Trump, including 55% of white women? With the United States consolidating itself as the world's most powerful imperialist nation and the economic gap in the country widening, right-wing movements have only grown at home, and the defeat of Trump will not halt their growth. The key to building a progressive majority is to keep mobilizing more young Latinos to vote, burying the small percentage increases in support for right-wing candidates under an avalanche from people of color, organized labor, and their allies.
Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez. To watch Juan's commentary in Spanish, visit democracynow.org/ES. When we come back, we'll hear from Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude and anti-racist activist Bree Newsome Bass. Stay with us.
I've been flipping through my timeline, trying to get my mind right. My city cried out, I got to cool down, but I'm under pressure. With my Crisco, look at what my fist go. A renegade when I'm in a rage. I got to cool down, but I'm under pressure. I keep my hands dirty, my mind clean. Got a new agenda with a new dream. I'm kicking out the old regime. Liberation, elevation, education. America, you a lie, but the whole world about to testify. I said the whole world about to testify, and the table's about to. The table's about to turn. Ain't gonna stop until it turn.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end this holiday special looking at the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who become the first woman vice president, as well as the first African-American, Indian-American, Caribbean-American, and Asian-American elected to the office. 2 days after the election was called for Biden and Harris, I spoke to two guests, Professor Eddie Glaude, chair of Princeton University's Department of African American Studies, and author of Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. And also, from North Carolina, I talked to Bree Newsome Bass, an artist, an anti-racist and housing rights activist. She made national headlines in 2015 when she scaled the 30-foot flagpole at the South Carolina State Capitol to remove the Confederate flag, shortly after the massacre of 8 African-American parishioners and their pastor by a white supremacist at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. When police ordered Bree Newsome down, she responded by saying,
"You come against me with hatred and oppression and violence. I come against you in the name of God. This flag comes down today."
"You come against me with hatred and oppression and violence. I come against you in the name of God. This flag comes down today," she said. I began by asking Bree Newsome Bass about her reaction to the election results.
Yes, I mean, it is undoubtedly a historic moment, right? I also see a lot of historical parallels right now. You know, I am repeatedly saying that I think that the central conflict in the United States is and has always been this tension between the ideology of white supremacy and this concept of having a multiracial democracy where everyone is allowed to participate in it. And I think that tension is continuing to play out today. You know, of course, we just had the election of the first woman vice president, Black vice president, you know, a woman of South Asian descent, a descendant of immigrants. I mean, and so on one hand, you have what kind of like represents, again, this concept of multiracial democracy. On the other hand, on the other side, you have a blatant white nationalist movement. And then somewhere there in the middle is this constant conversation around unifying the nation and trying to like heal that divide, which I frankly think is an ideological divide that cannot be unified. I think that part of the reason why this tension is ongoing and is unresolved is because those two things cannot coexist. And so even while you have on one side, you know, the extension of the hand and this language around healing the nation and reaching across the aisle and unifying, the other side has still not even conceded the race. The other side is refusing to acknowledge the election results. And I think it's important to recognize as well that the entire Trump era was in many ways a backlash, right, to this very concept of having a multiracial democracy, to the election of Obama and, you know, what that represented in terms of the shifting demographics. And I think that this election, again, is kind of like another echo of that, where Biden and Harris, they were elected because of this multiracial coalition, essentially, that formed among the voting base. And that's why we are where we are. And so while, of course, it is a very historic moment and you see people celebrating all across the nation, that central conflict has yet to be resolved, just as this election really in many ways has yet to be resolved.
And Professor Eddie Glaude, and feel free to channel James Baldwin if you'd like, which I think you can't help but do. If you can talk about what your feelings were on Saturday as you watched Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ascend the stage in Wilmington, Delaware, what this all means.
Well, you know, my initial reaction was, thank God we're going to see the back of Donald Trump's head. That the disaster of the last 4 years, at least embodied in the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, Betsy DeVos, William Barr, the whole gaggle of folk, Giuliani, the children, all of those folk will be behind us soon. And of course, the symbolic significance of Kamala Harris as the first Black vice president, the first Black president of South Asian descent and Caribbean descent, and the like. I was thinking about the National Council of Negro Women. I was thinking about the Atlanta washerwomen strike of 1881. I was thinking about the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, who were the backbone of the Montgomery bus boycott. I was thinking about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. All of these folk are the wind behind Kamala Harris's back that make her possible. But she's a symbolic, also the symbolic importance of her, of course. Right? But we must understand that yesterday was a day and the day before was a day of celebration. Today is the day for the hard work. The country is deeply divided, as Bree said, and we have to get about the work of responding to the problems we face as a nation at scale and not returning back to some sense of normalcy, which in some ways laid the foundation for the disaster that was and is Trumpism.
As we continue our conversation with Eddie Glaude and as well as Bree Newsome Bass, we're going to turn right now to a comment that is brewing part of the debate that's happening right now about the direction of the Democratic Party. This is House Majority Whip James Clyburn of South Carolina, who went on several Sunday talk shows to criticize calls to defund the police, arguing the phrase hurts Democratic congressional candidates. Here he is on NBC's Meet the Press, citing the defeat of Jamie Harrison in South Carolina against incumbent Republican Senator Lindsey Graham.
Jamie Harrison started to plateau when defund the police showed up with a caption on TV right across his head. That stuff hurt Jamie. And that's why I spoke out against it a long time ago. Right. I've always said that these headlines can kill a political effort.
That's Congressmember Clyburn speaking on the Sunday talk shows. Clyburn is credited with really Joe Biden winning the Democratic primaries, having endorsed him right before the South Carolina primary, which then launched him to victory. I wanted to first go to Bree Newsom-Bass. You're in the Carolinas, but you're in the other one. You're in North Carolina. Can you talk about this major debate, this debate for the soul of the Democratic Party right now, Bree?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, first of all, to this argument that is being made so fiercely right now, attacking the defund the police effort, I mean, I have yet to see anyone provide any concrete data that supports that claim other than people making this conjecture. I mean, I live in the Carolinas. I have seen all of the ads that have been running. I mean, they were also running a lot of ads trying to tie Jamie Harrison to Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi. So, I mean, unless someone is showing data that can really show that, one or the other is what led to Jamie Harrison specifically plateauing in South Carolina, which is a deeply red state, was an uphill battle against, Lindsey Graham to begin with. I frankly don't give that a whole lot of weight. And I think, again, we cannot gloss over the racial aspect of this whole situation. So we're talking about a situation where the Democratic leadership is making the claim, simultaneously making the claim that we need to reach across the aisle, we need to engage in bipartisanship with the party that is not acknowledging the election results, the party that just tried to prevent us from having a free and fair election, the party that engaged in rampant voter suppression, disenfranchisement, and intimidation, and particularly in communities of color. The party that is completely opposed to the idea of our existence. The party that is essentially advocating a form of genocide through medical neglect that has been, ravaging our communities. And so we can't just gloss over when people are saying that the path forward is to build with Republicans and at the same time to essentially demonize, make a boogeyman of Black activism and Black causes. It is the organizers, the same exact people who have been organizing Black communities around issues that impact us, that mobilize those voters for the Biden-Harris win. I've also seen people making reference to progressives as being the ones who are being divisive, or ending the truce within the Democratic Party, and it's quite the opposite. You had a situation where you have a significant segment of people who, either traditionally vote Democrat, a lot of people who are completely disengaged from the electoral process completely, because they feel that regardless of who is in power, their needs are not met. Regardless of, who is in power, the police continue to kill us. Regardless of who is in power, we do not have access to proper health care. We do not have access to housing. So you had a lot of organizers who had to do a lot of heavy lifting to convince folks that it was worthwhile simply to get Trump out, to mobilize behind Biden and Harris. And that's why you got Georgia turning out as it did. That's how you got Arizona, turning out as it did. So in my view, for anyone to look at the election results and for the takeaway to be, we need to figure out how to appeal to the Lindsey Graham voters and, and the deeply red districts, as opposed to recognizing that there's an entire electorate that is younger, that represents, where the electorate is going. It's younger, it's more diverse. It can win you states in the South. This is the argument that Stacey Abrams has been making for quite some time. Instead of looking at things and saying, how can we invest more in Black and Indigenous and people of color organizing? How can we, really look at those issues? I mean, politically, that makes a lot more sense than saying, how do we tap into the electorate that lost the presidential election, the electorate that is shrinking, and then morally, the electorate that opposes democracy, because they are more committed to racism than they are to the idea of a democracy that allows everyone to participate. So, again, I just think that we cannot gloss over. And yes, I recognize, of course, that James Clyburn is a longstanding, politician from South Carolina. He is Black, and I am sure that he recognizes what the political landscape is like in South Carolina. But if we're looking at the bigger picture, they're going to cost themselves the Senate race in Georgia if the case that they're making is that we're going to try to lean more towards Republican, then making it clear to people that unless they turn folks out for those Senate seats in Georgia, you're not going to have access to the things that you need, like healthcare and all these other things. So if they embrace a more, centrist or Republican agenda, then the takeaway from folks is going to be, again, that it doesn't matter whether they turn out to vote or not. So I think it's just like the complete opposite. And the fact that the focus in the immediate aftermath of the election, when we are still dealing with the situation of a president who does not acknowledge the election results, we've got him stoking violence among white supremacists who are threatening violence against sitting governors, who have threatened to blow up ballot counting centers, that folks would pick defunding the police as the target, as the threat, as the danger. When you're talking about communities that are still being killed by police and still turning out to support this party in spite of that, complete opposite direction of where they should be going.
That brings us to Professor Eddie Glaude. Professor, you tweeted this quote from James Baldwin: "It has always seemed much easier to murder than to change, and this is really the choice with which we are confronted now." Explain.
Well, there's a sense in which the reckoning that we find ourselves involves the question of whether or not we're going to fundamentally embrace the idea that we are a multiracial democracy. And the history of the country suggests that we constantly, when faced with that question, will double down on violence. That white America will choose violence to defend its way of life, to defend those noxious assumptions that have in some ways led to the organization of our way of life predicated upon this idea that white people ought to be valued more than others, that they will in fact, exact a certain kind of violence to defend that view. And so Baldwin in this moment is kind of marking this, right? That is, America's always talking about it changing, but it never changes, right? And so what's so interesting about the conversation around the Democratic Party is that it's actually insane, right? That we would think that the way to respond to the scale of problems that we confront as a nation is to hearken back to an older form of politics that is DLC, third way democratic politics that seems to try to triangulate and appeal to this Reagan Democrat that they are so obsessed with as a way of responding to this problem. It makes no sense that we would go back to the politics that actually produced Trumpism in the first place. That's the first point. The third point is this: we can't allow these folk to disentangle Trumpism from the Republican Party. I think this is what Bree Newsom-Bass is trying to suggest to us. We can't allow them to disentangle these two things. They are one and the same. So what are you asking for when you talk about reaching across the aisle? What are you asking us to do when you talk about reaching across the aisle in unity? We won't do that again. That's not going to happen this time. And then lastly, we need to get beyond, I think, these narrow labels. The politics is much more muddled, right? We need to get beyond these narrow labels. We need to get beyond big government and small government and smart government and get to transformational government. We need to understand what defund the police means. Budget your values. Budget your values. That's what it means at the heart of it, right? Why are you spending 60, 70% of your municipal budgets on policing when you have education, social services, and the like? Stop lying. Stop lying. And then what we need to pay attention to, lastly, I'll say this really quickly. We need to pay attention to who Biden appoints as his Secretary of Treasury. If we get another Rubinite, if we see someone in that tradition, we know what we got. And so remember, we celebrate yesterday and the day before, but today begins the hard work. The problems of this nation require us to break from the old frames. And we will not allow Clyburn. We will not allow Kamala Harris's symbolic insignificance. We will not allow the threat of Donald Trump to get us from seeing that that is the issue. We have to break the political frame that got us in this mess in the first place.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Glaude, black male voters, a lot of being made of, came out in higher numbers for Trump this time than last time. But my colleague, co-host Juan Gonzalez, did a brilliant analysis of the information that's come out on who voted in this unprecedentedly high turnout campaign, the highest in absolute history. Now, what it looks like at this point, as he was pointing out, white voters did not increase that much. That meant people of color increased. Yes, there were more people of color who voted for Trump, but overwhelmingly more who voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Apparently, many people are concerned about, obviously many people are concerned about how close the election was. Trump winning possibly about, at this point, 57% of the white vote. And you, in your piece in Time magazine, said alongside the details of policy and the particulars of governing a deeply divided country, Biden will have to confront what Donald Trump refused to face, that our way of life is broken. Can you end with that?
Sure. I think, we have to deal with the reality of our dead. Close to 240,000 Americans are dead, and there's no communal public rituals to acknowledge the collective grief and individual sorrow that we're experiencing. We have to deal with loneliness, and what does it mean for us to be stuck in our homes and hidden behind our mask, where social interactions kind of overdetermined by the specter of death and the virus. And then, of course, the principal issue is selfishness. That you have folk who have been simply given up stake in the American life for their own selfish ends. And so when we look at those numbers among black men and Latino men, we can say that, the epidemic of selfishness doesn't end at the doorstep of white people. And so you have people who are concerned about their 401ks, concerned about their own individual self-gain, individual self-interest. And so these folk have opted out in some ways of any robust conception of the public good. So we're going to have to deal with death, loneliness, and selfishness, and how it poses, I think, an existential threat to our democratic way of life. But, everybody's bringing up black men. When you look at black folk, when you think about what happened in Atlanta, when you think about what happened in Milwaukee, when you think about what happened in Detroit, when you think about what happened in Philly, you see that the path for Biden-Harris ticket to get to the White House through black America, black men voted at 80+%. They need to start talking about why white women have voted at 56% for Donald Trump, given what he's done. But again, who's at the center of the gravity of our politics? Who are folks thinking about all the time in a certain sort of way? These numbers will allow us to drill down at some point, but we need to understand the reality for what it is.
Last 30 seconds, Bree Newsome-Bass.
Yes, I think that there is this constant abusive relationship between party politics and black communities where we are scapegoated when it's convenient, and then we are thrown under the bus when it's convenient. And otherwise, it's, show up to the polls to help us stay in power because we can't get elected without you. And that's a dynamic that has to end. And when it's time to try to scapegoat and talk about, why did Trump do better, then they want to talk about black men. When it's time to talk about the issues and why 80% of black men turned out to vote for Biden, no one wants to talk about defunding the police. That's the dynamic that has to end. And I think the last thing I would say is it's important for everyone to recognize that the black movement, the black organizing of our communities, that is independent of the Democratic Party. We are interacting with party politics, but this movement began during the Obama administration. It continued through the Trump administration, and it will continue through the Biden administration.
Anti-racist activist Bree Newsome-Bass and Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude. That does it for today's show. Coming up tomorrow, 4 days in Western Sahara, Africa's last colony. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alkoff, Tamery Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, and Adriano Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.